1. All right, we are live. It says we are live, and this is the first broadcast from my new rig. So it should be an interesting way to test it. We actually tried to have this stream a couple of times already, but there were severe technical difficulties, all on my end. And he was patient enough to stick through both of those failed attempts and also come back for this one. So thank you to Mike for that. I'm going to tweet this out and post about it on Facebook. Let me know if there's any issues with the audio. But with all of that being said, this is the interview that I've wanted to have for a couple weeks now about his particular approach to bottom unity and also the caucus that he has going for, and if I'm correct, it's not your caucus specifically, it's somebody else's, but you're heavily pushing it because you like what they stand for.
Yes, that's basically it. In fact, I've been traveling so much, I've only been to actually one of its meetings. I just know the people that are organizing it, and I trust them, and I like what they're doing. I think it's a cool. Well, I'll explain more after we get through our intros and stuff.
Gotcha. Well, so you are the Arizona LP's second vice chair, and you wanted to talk about the Voluntaryist Caucus and bottom unity. So why don't we start with who you are and what you've been doing?
So I am Mike Shipley. So you either probably have already heard of me. You might either love me or hate me. And if you hate me, it's probably you may not have, how do I put it? There's a lot of misconceptions about me out there. So if you are listening, I do ask that you take a second chance to get a new impression, because a large part of what I've been doing lately, especially running for National Party Chair, is going to these different state conventions and actually getting to meet people for the first time. And the really cool thing about the bottom unity frame around sort of the expansion of what counts as a capital L libertarian and the way that we understand our role within the broader anti-authoritarian movement is that it kind of it diminishes, I suppose, the sort of tension that at least I remember feeling quite a bit of back in the day. There used to be a lot of tension between so-called prags and radicals. There used to be a lot of tension between ANCAPs and LibSocs. And the entire logic of all that was kind of this idea that we need to hold each other accountable to a single sort of ideological definition. Like, for instance, if somebody is an ANCAP, this idea that someone who's speaking their ideas through a different rhetorical framework is somehow like a threat to your end goal of freedom. And this was shared by, if you were a constitutionalist, then someone who was speaking of completely dismantling the state altogether was a threat to your, the vision that you're kind of placing your hopes into, right? And bottom unity kind of flipped the script all that. So for those of you who, a lot of people know what this is now, but if it's a new term to you, that political compass, that square chart where the vertical axis is authoritarianism and the left-right axis is economic point of view, where the right-hand end is total capitalism and the left-hand end is total socialism. That political compass on that chart, the entire bottom half is basically the anti-authoritarian half, and it contains a lot of different ideologies, from anarcho-capitalism to night watchman minarchism to classical liberalism, mutualism, Georgism, anarcho-syndicalism, anarcho-communism. I could go on, and libertarians love kind of discussing the nuances of those different ideas.
No, that's a nice way to put it.
Yeah, well, we do. And I guess one thing I want to kind of stop is to ask us to think about why that was. And I think there's a rational explanation that can help us kind of recognize that it's okay to maybe let our guard down with other anti-authoritarians and save that kind of fight or flight response for the authoritarians. And that is that political systems, our economic systems, they really are life or death matters of discussion. Political systems actually have the power to kill people, and they do it every day. And it's not just theoretical, it's that they operate on a logic of coercive force. Wherever there's coercive force, there's the very real threat of that force culminating in the death of its subjects, right? So we kind of inherently, especially as libertarians, that's like a core part of everybody's critique on that bottom half. We all know that we're fighting a monstrous entity that doesn't really care one way or another whether we live or die, as long as it gets what it wants. So it's a very rational reaction in that state, in those circumstances, to actually have a fight or flight response. Like, it's literally the survival instinct. So when someone's perceived as like a threat to the goal of human liberty, it's completely natural to kind of go into like survival mode. Like, I'm fighting for my own literal life in that case. And I think the mistake that we may have been making in the past is directing that survival instinct towards other anti-authoritarians under the mistaken idea that not all of those libertarian ideologies were maybe acting in good faith toward the cause of a world set free. And what Bottom Unity has done by calling for all of those anti-authoritarian ideologies to unite against the authoritarian top is, at least for me, and I'm seeing this in other people too, is that it's like a continual reminder that other libertarians are not my enemy. And so it's a narrative of inclusion rather than exclusion, which doesn't mean that authoritarian ideas like, I don't know, like a border wall or, Medicare for all, those kinds of things that we often see some of our newcomers promoting, those are authoritarian ideas, and they should be subject to debate. Absolutely. But it doesn't mean that everybody who is going through a transition, 6 months from now or a year from now, are necessarily going to be promoting all of those same ideas. So some of them are authoritarians that are staunchly embedded in our movement and really should be subjected to like a continuous sort of pushback. And then others of them just haven't fully like grasped the entire scope of libertarian thinking. And those people can be sort of converted and retained over time. So anyway, I forgot your original question because I'm kind of just on a roll.
Well,
So
that's an interesting way to put it, because okay, so two major points, I guess. The first major point would be that a lot of people are afraid of transition periods that involve statism. Like, for instance, I highly respect this leftist political commentator on YouTube. His name is Peter Coffin. I don't know if you've ever watched his shit, but it's very good. Normally, my particular notion, though, he has this idea that if people are radicalized toward Bernie Sanders, they'll eventually become essentially ANCOMs. That because they're accepting the political solution, that they'll learn how to be an activist and eventually become an activist for the proper causes. Now, I can see where he's coming from, but I can also see the idea that previous transition periods through a Marxist framework ended up with a state that was massively larger than previous states. And that scares people rightly. And it means that people who have a sort of more libertarian mindset, but think there needs to be a statist transition period and a statist transition force, a lot of those people get people's hackles up, and rightly so. And it's the same way to me with the whole, like, let's use Trump to hashtag accelerationism, hashtag boogaloo. To me, the idea of using politics is inherently, like, somewhat flawed. And I'm always sort of wary about LP politics and politics in general. So I wonder if I could get your comment on that before I move on to the next point.
Well, sure. So I think that's a valid question, and I think it's something that I wish we could talk about more, I guess, calmly in libertarian spaces
Oh,
without,
yeah.
because the reality is that um, when you're doing electoral politics, at least this is how I think about it. We are playing with fire. We already know that the state is a monstrous institution that never withers away. It always works. People who have power will always use it to try to obtain more. Like
Right.
that's just,
It's an exponential ballooning effect.
it is. So, um, the historical pattern that we see is that state consolidates power and becomes more and more sort of oppressive and just monolithic in our lives, and then eventually people say enough is enough, and they have a revolution and they make a new government, and then the cycle starts all over. And so what I think about the revolutionary logic in that sense, I see basically, I look around me and I ask myself, am I surrounded by statists? And the answer is yes. So then it's kind of obvious to me that if we had a revolution, all they would do is create a new state. And I don't buy into the Marxist idea that it can ever be a worker state that would wither away and somehow magically be ethical just because it was run by workers, because workers are still human beings, and human beings obviously can't be trusted with coercive power over others.
Well, right, or like the obverse, where like you can't have like a state capitalist society where everybody's learning to exploit others for profit that suddenly turns into like a anarchist utopia where they're not going to be like using the state for their private ends. It's sort of like that for the obverse too.
Right. It's never going to limit itself. Like
Right.
limited government is just a fairy tale. So, with all of that said, um, for me, I'm just going to explain how my brain thinks about it, because I have to live with the choices that I make and the organizations I choose to align with. And I think about it like um, the goal of a world set free is dependent on being surrounded by majority anti-authoritarians.
Right.
And in order to, we're not there yet. In order to reach that goal, we need to create a mass movement of people who are actually anti-authoritarian.
No, we need to stay right where we are. Go ahead.
We need to stay right where we are. And so the electoral system is one way of doing that. If we become, I think it in two ways. And actually, this comes back to that old, this perceived conflict between prags and radicals. I think what was missing from that whole thing is that anarchists are really good at direct action. Anarchists are like totally on board with like building that new world. So anarchists are kind of, the anarchist imagination is kind of focused on what does a world set free look like? Why is cryptocurrency a better alternative than fiat currency, right? Um, what does a mutual aid network that can, actually supply um, enough food for people who are currently experiencing poverty? And then a companion question to that is, um, how much of that is really necessary in a marketplace where prosperity is actually flowing freely the way that it's supposed to, right? And so we're continuously sort of looking at what the new world looks like. And then the so-called prags or whatever, the electoral workers are constantly wanting to dismantle that, but there's like, oh, the anarchists, if you're not willing to circulate this clipboard, then, what are you even doing? Like, we don't have time for you, get out of our way, kind of thing. And those two narratives for me are completely compatible. If we were able to scale down the state as the new systems are emerging, I mean, this is putting a lot of faith in humanity. But like, I believe it's theoretically possible to actually scale down the skate as we build the new world. And it's almost, I believe that that's really the only sustainable long-term way, because the only other option is that revolution and new state cycle. Well, the third option is thinking that it's going to wither away without, I mean, but that's not going to happen either. Do you see what I mean? So, like, in other words, the project of helping other humans have an anti-authoritarian awakening is the path to a world set free, and then giving them space to figure out how to express their anti-authoritarianism the best. Some of them may be drawn to writing abolitionist legislation that slowly dismantles all the different pieces that need to be taken away. Some of them are going to be really into doing direct action in, you know, the mental among people with psychiatric disabilities, or you know, helping migrants get across the desert by giving them food and water, or, you know, offering them shelter to protect them from the deportation apparatus.
Sounds like commie bullshit to me.
Well, I guess if you want to label me, go ahead and label me.
Yeah.
Guilty as charged. But yeah, so that's how I think about that question.
All right. Well, and see, because that was the second question I had, is that, like, essentially there are more than one transition possible, and like, people are often surprised when I tell them my roots. I come from neoconservatism. I was a fucking dumb fuck cunt ass asshole in high school, and I do not make any reservations about saying that. I want to put my high school self in a locker, because the whole deal of, like, everything I was just super Republican, and, like, you know, with very few exceptions. And, like, I said Bush did nothing wrong, and I said we should glass Iran. I was one of those dumb fuck edgelords, and I came from that, and I'm an anarchist. And what it took was people being an extremely harsh, abrasive asshole to me until I wisened up and realized that what I was saying was not only contradictory to my alleged Christianity, but was contradictory to my other stated ethics. Like, these were things that I wouldn't be doing in other circumstances. And like, the whole idea of people being fixed, unchangeable people, just like a form in the void, to me, that is not only physically disproven by my transition, but disproven by the transitions I've helped other people get to. And I think when people think of, like, bottom unity, they think a lot of these people come from the left and they're unchangeable, or they come from the right and they're unchangeable. They think that they're fixed positions. They use one of the things that I came on to Peter Coffin about was essentialism, where you try to boil people down to a thing you can attack, rather than, like, looking at the broader picture and the assumptions that they could possibly be going off of. And I think that's a severe problem among especially libertarians, because a lot of them come from a more extremist modus. And, you know, my question to you would be, how do you get people to think more broadly and to stop, like, characterizing people on this essentialist basis, in favor of sort of, like, being level-headed, being open to alternatives, trying to understand?
Well, that is a good question. And, you know, I think the one answer that comes to mind, I mean, ultimately, it's basically just repeating yourself over and over and over again to a bunch of different people and sort of translating for them into the language of the people that they're fighting with. But I have found over time that, like, through having to do that so many times and just continuously being in mixed audiences where so let's say we're in a when we're in a comments thread, especially the more that bottom unity has succeeded in bringing more diverse voices to the table, the more it has been true that you'll be in a comment thread talking with one person, but you have no way of knowing when a different listener who speaks a different language, not a different, they're still speaking usually English, at least in the US, but I mean, if capitalism to you is a statist ideology inherently, then someone who uses the word capitalism to describe a completely free market is going to be speaking at cross purposes. And this triggers, remember back to that idea I told you about the survival instinct. If you recognize capitalism as the brutal imperialist economy that's actually ruining everyone's lives and killing people all day, every day, and you hear someone promoting capitalism, that's going to trigger your survival instinct.
Right.
Conversely, if you identify this current system as socialism, you recognize that your definition of that is just when the state does stuff, not to diminish or I get why people think. But anyway, my point is, if you see that as force and then you see a libertarian socialist trying to tell you that, that's just a market set free, that's going to trigger your survival instinct. And so what we get is people freaking the fuck out. And so back to, and you can never tell, you might think that you've reached an understanding with the person you're debating with, and then lo and behold, someone comes into the thread and just completely reacts to it. So I have found, number one, is just not using phrases like capitalism, socialism, or communism. I avoid those terms personally unless the other person kind of insists, and then I might go into parsing through where they're coming from and what they're talking about. But for me, I just use the phrase command economy when I'm talking about an authoritarian market intervention, or I might use a phrase coercive systems, or I guess really, and what's happening over time is that a vocabulary is emerging where instead of sounding like left right, it's sounding like top bottom. So when I want to lump all this together, I use a phrase that can be, that I know that my listener can if I say command economy and you think of that as capitalism, your brain is going to be able to parse that without getting triggered by the word. And the same is true from on the bottom. A lot of times I'll use the phrase, even just the term free market can be a trigger for some people because, the statist, the stock market, for instance, the word market can be a statist, right? So I'll just use a phrase like open voluntary markets, or I just use trade. I'll just say trade. Or if it's referring to an anarcho-communist idea, I might just use the phrase gift economy. And so for me, a lot of it is just about, to answer the question, how do you get people to open up their minds? It's very much about tiptoeing around that survival instinct and trying to avoid triggering that inadvertently with my speech. Ultimately, I don't need to win a territorial power struggle over what socialism means. I don't care, honestly, what you think socialism means, or capitalism, or communism. I don't even care what those words mean anymore. It's just infuriating, right? But if I can get past that, and make sure that I'm always naming an authoritarian institution when that's what I mean, and always speaking for freedom when that's what I mean, then we have something common to build on.
Yeah, well, and I think that's part of the thing, building the Rosetta Stone, trying to find common language, and it's always really fucking funny, when, especially knowing what I know about what those words mean. When I see, for instance, somebody on who claims to be on the right identifying with Konkin or Spooner, or when I see somebody on the left identifying with somebody like Larkin Rose, I'm like, great, good. You've just proven that these sides are somewhat arbitrary and that you can still fundamentally want the same things, and that usually freaks him out a little.
Yeah. Yes, I have noticed that too.
But Lysander Spooner is a great example. He tried to start a business, and his business was quelled. He tried to start the business so that he could form a libertarian socialist modus of mail delivery, and his mail delivery was quashed by the state. So he spent a significant amount of time pushing against that. Same with his sort of free market lawyer practice, and people on the right that have him as their profile picture, not knowing that this is what he believed, not knowing that he was part of one of the first libertarian socialist unions, and, frankly, the reason that anarchists have the Circle A. It's really funny to watch them sort of founder on their own conclusions. Same with leftists who favor sort of a free market capitalist modus, and appreciate it when Larkin Rose talks about the most dangerous superstition, and appreciate it when Radley Balco talks about the militarization of cops, but then disagrees with some of their conclusions that maybe there's just better ways to do this and the thing shouldn't be completely changed. It's interesting to watch people have problems with their own ideas and their own conclusions and the things that they themselves support. And when you realize that a lot of these people do have those sorts of contradictions, you can point it out to them and say, well, there are a lot of people like you on both sides, and maybe we could talk to each other and have a civil discussion. That's the whole point of anarcho-coalitionism, and I believe it's similar with the Voluntaryist Caucus and with bot immunity and with everything you're trying to do. So my question to you is, you're trying to, bring this Rosetta Stone to people. You're trying to help them get on that path. How do you get the average person started?
Well, one of the cool things about having a broader sort of palette to select from is that because mainstream politics, basically we're taking people out of left, right. Mainstream politics is really a tiny little space in the upper right of the, of that chart, but we call it right and left, so whatever. So I'll just kind of go with that languaging, right? So the mainstream right, they too have their own language, right? And one of the things I think about is that first of all, this isn't just accidental that people are divided up like that. The politicians are doing that on purpose because they know it, and it isn't just that the politicians are doing it, but that they're taking advantage of a instilled kind of indoctrination through the government school system.
Yeah,
right?
Entrained instinct.
Yes, we are trained to sort of look to authority, to assume that authority is the status quo. We're trained to conform, to associate our own success with how well we conform to the authoritarian institutions around us, and that conditioning is deeply ingrained. So first of all, I come from a place of, I guess, forgiveness.
Mm-hmm.
That I'm looking at a victim of the state, not necessarily someone who understands, kind of a forgive them for they know not what they do kind of vibe,
Mm-hmm.
It isn't necessarily their fault. Now, with all that said, we are responsible for what we do with the information that gets placed in front of us. So our job is to place the information in front of us. And I'll give you a concrete example because that's just the setup, right? Now that we have bot immunity, we have left flavored and right flavored rhetoric that we can offer to them to meet them where they're at. And so then the trick, at least in my mind, is waiting for them to have some sort of a glimmer of recognizing that they're being steamrolled. And the most recent example that I can think of that would be fresh in memory is actually, come to think of it, the more recent would be coronavirus, but I'm not even going to go there. I'm just going to back up to the Bernie thing. Super Tuesday, right?
Yeah.
Everyone was upset. Bernie's getting steamrolled. They know something's wrong. And they're critiquing the system that's steamrolling him. Okay.
Yeah. Hashtag fuck the DNC.
Hashtag fuck the DNC. They might not have the complete anti-authoritarian critique.
Yet.
And yes, they're glomming onto an authoritarian thinking he's going to set them free. But in that moment, they're feeling what it feels like for power to roll over you and not give a fuck what you think about it. And that's a moment where you can connect with them and build on it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And those little moments are happening like all the time. More recently with coronavirus, we're seeing a lot of people question what is happening. Is this an election year? Is this being manufactured? Why is it being manufactured? Who benefits from this? Who's controlling access to the testing kits? That kind of question. All
Mm-hmm.
of those are like little glimmers of anti-authoritarian awareness. And, you know, those are situational and they pass by very quickly. And there's always something new in the news cycle. But if the person or the camp or the system, if that camp is having their moment and you're like in the libertarian camp that can speak to them, if they're Democrats, we need our left libertarians to take that chance, step forward and provide them with a solid analysis, an anti-authoritarian analysis that can broaden their mind. If they're in the right-wing camp, we need our ANCAPs to step forward, and our
Right.
constitutional conservatives, we need them to step forward and supply that anti-authoritarian critique in that moment that will resonate with their that sort of open window that is in their mind in that time. And that, I think, is over time how we can kind of just peel them off a little bit at a time.
Right, the state does the opposite. There's a guy who gets widely mocked, but I think he has a lot of good things to say. He goes, his name is David Icke. I don't know if you're familiar with what he does, but
Mm-hmm.
I like one of the things he said quite a bit, which was that the state provides the problem, pre-engineers the reaction, and then like provides the solution to that reaction, so that they can increase their control. And sort of the opposite can be done for the anarchist ends. Like, we can see that they've created a problem, point that problem out, and give people an anarchist solution to it rather than the statist solution. I've been saying this for a bit. Like, they say let no good crisis go to waste. We could say the same thing, but try to prevent these crises from happening in the future by striking the root instead of hacking the branches. And I think a lot of people can sympathize with that. So I guess my question to you would be, how do you get people to see the root rather than the branches?
I mean, I guess you can only just, I mean, I don't think there's a single magic bullet, but um, yeah, I suppose I could turn that critique honestly, the answer to that, I would kind of turn it back towards our internal, almost tie that into the question you asked about the risks of electoral politics. We have to hold ourselves accountable also for always identifying the root. And I guess kind of keeping kind of in the I'm thinking of a like Game of Thrones. You know how like they're at Winterfell and they're like practicing with their swords because you never know when the next war is going to break out and you've got to always be like trained with your arms at all times. So on the battlefield of the mind, like our speech is our weapon. So we need really finely tuned, like the point is when you want to strike the root, what you're really doing is using your language to shine a light on what that root looks like and clearly how it connects to whatever issue you're talking about. Right. So like an example is transgender bathrooms. And we were completely like, when that whole issue struck, we were not well prepared for that because the root of that is really the birth certificate. You get assigned your gender at birth, and then the coercive power of state holds you in compliance to that gender the rest of your life. So by the time a small business owner is, trying to police their bathrooms by conspiring with the police to inspect your genitals, you've already been carrying around this assigned legal gender since birth for decades. And so if that root isn't like clearly, if we don't clearly like I just did, connect all of those dots, and that probably will be news to some of the listeners who haven't thought all that through. And this is actually, I don't know if I'm rambling too far, but it actually comes back to like, I want to reclaim this idea that so-called infighting is even bad. I mean, think back to that Winterfell analogy I made when, Arya and her brothers are practicing sword fighting. Like, is that infighting or is that training? Like, I think that like the conversations that we have with each other, especially now that bottom unity has like brought more of us together, those strengthen us and they give us the language and the vocabulary to clearly and brightly shine a light on. And you asked about how do you reveal the root issues to them. You have to practice at using your speech to illuminate it as quickly as possible and as clearly as possible when you have the chance.
Right. So, okay, I think so. What you're getting at is understand the issues well enough on your own because of personal reflection and because of like conversations with people closer to a libertarian mindset, that you can effectively find somebody's root problems more easily when you are in that confrontation, when you are in that situation. Um, I've never watched Game of Thrones, so I don't know the reference specifically, but it sounds like what you're saying is that it's better to be a warrior in a garden than a gardener in a war.
Oh yes, that is perfect. And one thing I don't know if I made this connection crystal clear, but like sometimes in particularly in capital L spaces, Libertarian Party spaces, there's pressure for us to like maybe tone down the rhetoric so that we don't frighten, the
Normies.
voter, or you're embarrassing me in front of my moderate friends, or whatever it is. And I wanted to just bring that out as kind of like, it's fine if like I think for a tactical like with my mom, I'm not gonna like bludgeon my mom with like business owners inspecting genitals. Like it's maybe a little too much for her, but I can soften that language without losing the logic, if that makes sense, right? So I get like identifying where your listener is and meeting them with nothing more harsh than maybe they can handle. But that is a very different thing than toning down the actual logic. For
Mm-hmm.
example, promoting like a milquetoast reform that isn't actually anti-authoritarian. That is different. So my point is, I guess sort of helping even other libertarians fall like deeply in love with um, being sort of. Sorry, I'm having trouble. Oh, Siri thinks I'm talking to her again. Um, you get it, right? Like, we ourselves have to be in love with actually striking the root ourselves.
Right.
And I don't think a lot of even like, especially in the top half of the bottom half, if that makes sense,
Oh, it
uh,
does.
they sometimes are uncomfortable with the deeper ramifications as well. And, getting them across that transition is also helpful.
Right. Well, and that's an interesting jump off point because the vast majority of the Libertarian Party is minarchist, and many of them are like fucking hydrophobic when it comes to like getting the sort of free flowing waters of liberty. They claim that anarchists can't be libertarians, despite the first libertarians being anarchists. They claim that libertarianism is all about reducing but not eliminating government, and they claim that the libertarian idea is being infiltrated, despite like political ends of libertarianism being the newer counterpart to the older anti-state sentiments that pervaded the original libertarian thought, at least in a political sphere. And they claim that this infiltration must be opposed because if you don't oppose the anarchists in the Libertarian Party will never get any traction because they'll always just be these terrible radicals. And those people, to me, and maybe I'm being too much of a cynical asshole because I am a cynical asshole and I definitely own that, but these people seem like they care more about their stupid fucking label than they do actually getting liberty. And to me, that sort of thing has to be eschewed. Those people must be exposed for the basically governmental moderates that they are. Like there's the independent label. If you don't like the idea of a radical libertarian party, don't be in one.
Well, so there's a lot going on there, and I think okay, so one thing that we've found lately, or there was some conversation about, is like what counts as bottom unity.
Mm.
You're saying it's the bottom half of the chart, but some of the people like near the top half of the bottom half of the chart are pretty authoritarian themselves, especially from an anarchist point of view. Um, and I get that, I see that, and depending on the personality, um, some of them are actively like actually you feel them as you described it almost trying to pull the bottom half up,
Mm-hmm.
and which is extremely counterproductive towards the goal of a world set free. With that said, so the conversation was about those people should not be embraced with bottom unity. They should be pushed out. And, kind of the takeaway, at least for me, after I thought about it, because I recognize that like that's real. And we don't ever want to like lose the integrity of the word like anarchist and have to like get a new word again because authoritarians keep stealing our words and making them into perverted inverted reflections of what they really were supposed to mean, but the bottom unity narrative overall is a narrative of inclusivity, so it isn't really very well suited for accountability work, right? So in other words, to do the accountability work, it's not saying that we don't or shouldn't do that, but that we need a different tool for that. And I'll give you a great example. There's border authoritarianism. So there's sort of current where we need a strong border, or at least a tightly secured one. And some people are even like promoting the wall as under the guise of incrementalism, because if you could keep all these immigrants out, then it would reduce the welfare state, allegedly, is the logic there. And it is insidiously, and I just for balance, I'll give you a parallel on the left. There's Medicare for all, and the idea that this would be an incremental improvement over the existing sort of insurance cartel regime.
Yeah, the current social paradigm.
Yes. And this logic makes sense to people. And the people that it makes sense to can fall into a couple of different clusters. Some of them are just newcomers who don't have a staunch anti-authoritarian critique yet. And so it just makes sense. And they're just genuinely like kind of still confused, and they're still going through a transition. And, I guess I can use myself as an example. When I first converted, I still thought public schools were like curing a balance, like knowledge is power, were like curing the imbalance. And we needed to have public schools. And if you wanted to abolish them, you wanted to keep the people stupid, and therefore you could dominate them. And I had it backwards, because basically indoctrinating the people is how you dominate them. And I know that now. It took me a year or two to really get past that. So my point is, there are well-intended people who are promoting these narratives who can be converted and retained over time. Then there are people who, in my opinion, have kind of taken, like the authority pill. Like they want to grab power under the existing constitution. And these are the people who are saying that anarchism is a bad idea. They're not really operating from anti-authoritarian logic. They may just be operating from like not even limited government logic, but just maybe small government logic, where small is an arbitrary term that it can be quite huge, but if it's smaller than even huger, then they can claim to be, libertarian. And because of that, I don't have an easy answer to the problem you identify, other than to name that it's real, but also to kind of, I guess, highlight that there's an opportunity to be individualized about how we identify who's doing what and for what reasons, and thereby how we sort of apply narratives of either inclusion and education and retention and conversion, or whether we apply narratives of accountability and exclusion and mistrust. So
But well, like I do, because I'm a cynical asshole. But not everybody needs to be me.
well, but at least one person needs to be you, and it's you. So if that's a role that comes naturally to you, then I think there is a place for that as well. Like, we do need to be held accountable to our ideas, and if we aren't living up to the you know the promise of a world set free, then that needs to be talked about. And that is real, and that's not going away. Just because bottom unity, like, that doesn't mean that everyone gets to just waltz in and use unity as a weapon to pretend that they have the best interest of every libertarian in mind.
Well, right, because that's sort of part of the problem I see. I fucking can't tell you how many times a Nazi or a tanky has been mad at me because I poked holes in one of their ideas for authoritarianism, and how many times these people have also simultaneously called themselves libertarian. And I think that a lot of the problem exists in people who claim to be libertarians, but their ideas and policies in practice result in a dramatically unfree outcome. Um, like there's a certain point where you have to question whether they're moving in a libertarian direction so that they can hike themselves up to the top of the chart when people are weaker, or whether they're moving in the direction of libertarianism to eventually result in a negative 10 on the y-axis. And like I think a lot of people are very concerned, and rightly so, that exploiters are getting in, pedophiles on both the left and the right in quote libertarian circles should be brought to light and excommunicated because they're exploiters. Nazis and tankies who want to disguise themselves as right anarchists or left anarchists need to be expelled. And people need to know who they are and how to recognize them in order to do that. The question is where you draw that line in order to sort of preserve the movement and prevent it from being diluted. Because if anarchy just means you can be whatever you want, including statist, anarchy doesn't mean anything.
Right. I completely agree with you there. And I guess I can just keep coming back to, over time. I mean, I remember back in the day using even words like rads and prags. They don't resonate with me in the same way anymore because I have found that it's just, in other words, I guess my point is it comes back to an individualized kind of assessment. So when I think about a podcaster like Dave Smith, who's going on his podcast and he's hosting white nationalist figureheads and failing to push back some of the core logic of their ideas, we should be skeptical of that. And those people are not above critique. And especially when you have a platform like that, in my opinion, there is a responsibility to sort of ensure that what counts as free speech on your platform is furthering anti-authoritarian goals, if that's really what you're after. And if not, if we're creating gray areas, I suppose I could come back to maybe just a generic candidate, or even think about somebody like Johnson Weld. Those people were presented as ideal candidates because they were moderates. They had governing experience. They had the sort of traditional respectable resumes, things like that. But on the campaign trail, the policies they were speaking weren't always staunchly rooted in an anti-authoritarian logic.
Bake the damn cake.
Yeah, it was. And oh my God, Don't even get me started on that, because I was chair of Outright at the time, and like I was desperately trying to like get a hold of them, to like let them know that we have messaging, like we've already been fighting this battle for years. We have language you can use that will like both affirm, um, gender and sexual minority liberation, while also recognizing that cakes will never set us free, and we don't need to make a demand. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
We have language worked out that can help you with this. Like, will you please listen? And like, they wouldn't, because career politicians know better than us, and we don't answer the phone to the grassroots or whatever it was. The point is, they were confusing people, and we were getting flooded with people who were confused, and it was creating a great deal of internal conflict. And so I guess that is a far better example, because I'm sure the Dave Smith fanboys are already like flooding my page with hate speech as we speak. But so just to distance yourself from that, my point is, if you have a platform, there's a responsibility to make sure that you're speaking a clear message, in my opinion. So I forgot the original question. I'll just leave it.
Dave Smith is an interesting inroad to that, because I would gladly have him on and be on his show. Because first off, I think there's a possibility he didn't know as much about Cantwell as everybody else did, or the alt-right. There's a possibility. I'm a cynic, and my brain is like always screaming to not listen to those possibilities. But there is a possibility. Now, the secondary thing is, I used to be a Glass Iran neocon who supported Bush. And if we're trying to do the whole like unity route, because we're trying to say that people can be reached, maybe having somebody on like Cantwell is a way to get them closer to your mindset, if you're of that like sort of persuasion. And maybe having these figures on and letting them speak is a good way to get people to know how much of a piece of shit they are. I mean, Cantwell said some shitty things on that episode, and we now know that he said those shitty things because of that episode. And we didn't even have to go to his site. We didn't have to give him any clicks or any views. We got to see what he thought without any risk of supporting him. So there is that element. And like secondarily, I'm a controversial asshole figure. Like, I've been accused of running hate groups, of running cults, of being a bigoted doxer who hates women, a whole host of things that aren't actually provable, but that people are very convinced of. Similarly, having you on, you were in that thread where people were talking about you when I even suggested having you on. Like they said that I needed to ask you about murdering landlords or company owners, and also how tearing down well-known libertarians helps the liberty movement, by Chris Kofor. Those were some of the questions I was asked to ask. And so having controversial figures on, to me, gives them a chance to clarify some of the things they might have thought, and either prove themselves to be good people or prove themselves to be pieces of shit. So there is something to that. Like, I don't necessarily agree with having Cantwell on because I watched his sort of story arc. But Dave Smith is a comedian, he has a lot of shit on his plate. There's a potential that he didn't even know.
I mean, there is, but I don't want to die on Dave Smith Hill, but maybe I'm already on Dave Smith Hill, dead already, but whatever. Just look at because that's the theory. Oh, maybe having them on will reveal what a piece of shit they are. So we're going to stop having this alt-right problem. But that isn't actually what happened. The problem got worse because when those of us who observed that Nick Fuentes or, Chris Cantwell are literal human pieces of shit, when we called attention to that, we were shut down. We were called losers. The idea that I have to think that I died on Dave Smith Hill because I pointed out that someone was a piece of shit who allegedly, the benefit of having them on is to reveal that they're pieces of shit. So am I part of the benefit or not? Because all I'm doing is saying what allegedly having him on was supposed to prove. So there's that.
Well, okay. So if that's the tack, right? Because I can see where you're coming from, and I sympathize with it for sure. If that's the tack, let me ask you: is murdering landlords or company owners voluntary?
Murdering a human being is never voluntary.
Right. Okay. And let me see some of the other questions here. Uh, a dude that unfriended me later, I'm guessing because he found out that I'm not like alt right. He says you advocate hardcore drug use and sexual degeneracy just to clap back at your perception of at your perception of norms. Can you comment on that?
Okay, first of all, I don't quote advocate those things as like an active, like you should do this. Some people live carefree lives, especially in our youth, and other people don't. It's more about saying that what comes naturally to each one of us as we're going through our explorative period of self-discovery, discovering who we are, what makes us tick. Those are valid life choices. And there's this sort of fear narrative that the authoritarian systems rely on this logic of sort of dividing up like the good people and the bad people. Because if we can believe that there are bad people, then we can be persuaded to consent to consolidated power to control those bad people, either to subject them to punishment or to just remove them completely. And so it really is authoritarian logic to create these stigmas around behaviors. And so I did go through a lot of that in my youth. I'm a survivor of addiction and homelessness. So I know full well the consequences and the terrible quality of life, that I suffered. But not everybody is an addict. A lot of people can use safely. A lot of people can do a line of coke at the club on Friday night, and they can go dancing, and they go home, they go to sleep, and they wake up the next day, and they go back to their responsibilities. And the number of people that really wind up suffering through addiction are a relatively small number compared to those who can use safely. And it simply doesn't make sense to build a giant system of institutional control for people that are peaceful and just doing things that you just don't want them to do.
John McAfee.
Yeah, I mean, it's just not, and even for the people that are addicts, I can tell you every encounter that I ever had with enforcement only made my life worse. And the worse my life got, the more I tried to use drugs to make the pain of that go away.
Right.
You're actually participating in the cycle that is like, and I get that it's a delusion. Like I know full well that that was an error in reasoning. The thing that's making my life suck is not going to make it better, no matter how much of it I shovel into as many holes as I can fit it into. Like there's just not enough dope in the world to fill a painful hole that big, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And so the way I actually found recovery had
hold on just a second. For some reason, your audio just cut out. Did you mute yourself? Yeah, it says you're muted. There you go.
Okay. When I finally found recovery, it had nothing to do with people that tried to shame me or make me want to just self-destruct even more, or that I was worthless and didn't deserve to walk the planet. It was when I found other addicts who had already recovered, who treated me like a human being, who gave me the encouragement to believe that I actually deserved a life too. And it was love, not fear or hate, but love that brought me back out of that. And if you have done any time volunteering at all in the addiction recovery community, you'll hear that story over and over and over again.
Right. Well, I forget what his name is. It's not coming to me right now. But there was this guy who went in to the KKK and helped try to convince them to not. He was a black guy who went in and helped them try to convert away from it. And he apparently successfully got like 100 plus of them to stop being Klansmen, and his approach was similar. So what I thought I would ask you in relation to that was, I mean, you have a problem with Dave Smith platforming Cantwell at all, or do you have a problem with Dave Smith specifically his approach to platforming Cantwell?
Here's what, if I could just put it in my own words, we know that there is a pipeline between right libertarian spaces and authoritarian right wing spaces. We
Right.
watched Chris Cantwell pass through that pipeline. We watched, many former Ron Paul adjacent ANCAPs follow that pipeline and become Trump supporters. So if it's very similar to the way I think LibSocs and other left libertarians should. We are in the best position to hold other left anarchists accountable. When we see somebody starting to promote Marxist-Leninist logic about a worker state and gulags or things that lead to authoritarian systems, we're in the best position to hold that person accountable and to make an individualized decision. Can they be retained? Can they be sort of saved? Or do they need to be pushed out? When right libertarians try to do that work, all it does is cause the left-wing voices to like circle the wagons. And the same is true in reverse. So the problem is this pipeline exists and we know it exists, and right libertarians know that it exists too, but they are failing to actually patrol that pipeline themselves. And so the party is getting flooded with border authoritarians. They're getting paid. They have an affiliate, a referral link that they get $5 per membership to monetize recruiting people who are authoritarians and have no intention of ever becoming libertarian by telling them, oh, the party is just far left. We need you to come in to help fix this far left problem of wanting to like not have a border wall. And who else ends up having to call that out but people like me? And it has the same effect. It causes the whole right wing to like circle the wagons. And of course, if there's hero worship involved and these figures are considered like untouchable and uncriticizable, it just makes it worse. But like, just to like nail it home, what we're really asking right libertarians to do is patrol that yourself.
Right.
And if they were doing that, if we could see that a reliable distinction was being made between well-intended people having a genuine anti-authoritarian awakening who just happen to still think borders matter in the same way that like I held on to thinking public schools mattered for a year or two. That's a fundamentally different dynamic than one where the person is being told a border is just like a front door. If you have a right to shut your front door, then surely you have a right to build a wall. And like that is being reinforced. And we're seeing that happen. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's my answer.
So you're saying we should be more vigilant in that regard, but so should they. And if you want to be one of those right libertarians, if you're going to have a right libertarian on or a rightist on in general, you need to hold them accountable personally so that nobody else has to.
Sure. I know the way that I use my speech, when like I talked earlier about, like softening the language depending on your listener. And when I do that, I'm really, really careful of whether I leave like teeny little loopholes for like authoritarian thinking to like slip through. And you may have heard me a lot of times. I'll notice that I left room for left rightness, this left rightness to like, and I'll be like, oh, for balance, let me mention it Medical for All. Like I'm continuously like policing my own language
Right.
to ensure that I'm drawing down, that I'm trying to eliminate that vertical sense of, that like I'm unpacking the conditioning to the best of my ability. I'm not a perfect human being. None of us are, but I'm just asking people to be more careful. And when we hear you not being careful, then expect to have someone ask you. And if you don't respond to being asked, for that to escalate because it matters.
Okay. That's reasonable. I think I think part of the problem, though, is a lot of people aren't interested in having that conversation calmly. Like, for instance, the left in the libertarian circles were very, very quick to jump on Dave Smith. And they have been. I've watched them do it to multiple other rightist sort of libertarians. Um, but, like, for instance, uh, Peter Quinones, he has a great podcast called Free Man Beyond the Wall. He's had me on twice, and the second time was even to dispel myths that the right was trying to push. They were trying to say that, and they still try to say this, which is bullshit, that the Nazis were left wing, so that they can claim that the right is clean. And so I came on his show to talk about the Night of the Long Knives, the rum purge, all that noise where Hitler finally ended the lives of all of the people on the left who supported him because he was really a rightist. Um, the I came on to talk about that, and Peter's had on Gary Chartier of the of C4SS to talk about how we should do markets, not capitalism. He's had on many left-wing figures, but people always talk about, like, for instance, when he had, oh man, I can't remember his last name right now, but Kevin something or other of attackthesystem.org. When he had that guy on, he got a ton of hate because Kevin, or maybe Keith, I can't exactly remember which right now. The name is not occurring to me. Had also spoken at an alt-right conference where there was also, I think maybe more than once, where, like, he had spoken about anarchy and tried to get these people to become more anarchist. So even that got him hate. Peter got a significant amount of people telling him he was basically a fascist podcast now. People say the same thing about Tom Woods because of, like, a few guests he's had on. I'm wondering how much we have to avoid having any sort of connection with any, like, even twice removed or three times removed, with anybody affiliated with the state. Because, like, let me tell you, I hate Cantwell to a significant degree, especially since I used to appreciate a lot of what he said, especially when he was talking about game-ending pigs. That was a nice part of his life. But, like, watching him slide the direction he did was severely problematic, and as I'm sure we can both agree. But there comes the point where you gotta wonder who we can and can't talk to, because, yeah, while we can and can't, or while we shouldn't talk to people like him, not having the conversation at all seems to be the wrong approach. Maybe I'm missing something here, but like, I would be considered in the same boat with a lot of these people, because, like, I've talked positively about Cantwell before, back when he was talking about game-ending cops, and Cantwell hasn't killed anybody, to my knowledge. But I also had a conversation, for instance, with an anti-war veteran who has killed innocent people he admitted were innocent. And he came on to discuss how he transitioned into an anti-war person from being a veteran. And that incident of him taking innocent life was one of his prime reasons for becoming anti-war, for becoming anarchist. And so Cantwell, while terrible, absolutely, and I'm not saying he's not, he's never taken a life. So, I mean, who's worse ultimately? Who's the worst guest? Who should we have on and who shouldn't we have on in that regard?
So I'm going to back up a little bit here and maybe zoom out, because it isn't about a blacklist of names. And to be clear, anarchist justice is restorative and transformative. So this logic where no one is disposable and everyone can be redeemed means, just like you're describing, people who have had awakenings can be incredible. spokespeople that can convert many others away from authoritarian movements. But not everybody in those movements has already had an awakening. And so I want to just zoom out, and because we've been on the topic of kind of authoritarian logic and how it's instilled in us. The reason why no platforming is considered like kind of like a primary, it's like a first line tactic, because authoritarian personalities gravitate towards the perception of power. In other words, if a person can plausibly actually offer, like if you can like believe that they can actually deliver on the white ethno state or on the wall or whatever, crypto fascist or even crypto communist, whatever you want to call it, any authoritarian sort of, this is why even Bill Weld and Gary Johnson are attractive figures to those people in the top half of the bottom half. Because they can plausibly offer a pathway to that power that is desired to be grabbed. So access to a platform is the perceived access to power, because that person now is legitimized. They have lots of listeners. They are being perceived as on the rise. So the point of denying platforms or keeping proto-fascist movements off of platforms is to sort of think about I'm sorry, I just got distracted because I saw a comment. I will call you back right after this, Robert Allens. I see your comment. Authoritarians on platforms attract other authoritarians, and they blossom into full-blown authoritarian movements. So putting them on a stage and debating them does nothing. In fact, it actually adds to that dynamic. Interviewing Chris Cantwell over and over and over and over again makes him look powerful to people who are seeking a path to a fascist power grab.
I can see that.
Like Richard Spencer on a platform over and over again, debating him on every fucking YouTube channel on the fucking planet. That makes him look powerful, and it causes more people to follow him that want fascism. So debating them does nothing, because authoritarian logic is inherently irrational.
Right.
The idea that you can murdering everybody gives you power over them. I mean, what's the point of having power over anyone that's dead? Why would you want? I mean, I don't know. I'm just like, it's irrational. I mean, somebody existing in a brown body is erasing you by existing. That doesn't even make sense. So the idea that you can overcome that, well, now granted, like some people are rational and they can be reached and people can be persuaded, but putting the sort of the charismatic figure on a platform doesn't do that. All it does is expose their would-be followers to that power dynamic. So that's what no platforming does. I know some people don't agree, but so like if I have a platform and I have tens of thousands of listeners, then I'm going to be very careful about putting an authoritarian on that platform, because it's going to work against my own interests no matter how well I debate them. And particularly if I only very weakly debate them, if my pushback is like 5%.
If you don't hold them accountable, if you ask them softball questions intentionally.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. In fact, in a way, you're like signaling that they are so powerful that they cannot be directly criticized.
Well, so okay,
there's a psychological thing going on there.
So, just to be clear, there's almost zero possibility he's watching this, but Dave Smith, if you see this and you do want to be on my show or want me on your show, I will be interested in that for some reason. I mean, I'm the long-haired asshole everybody hates, so I don't give a shit whether or not the answer is yes, but like personally, I will go on either show. I wouldn't, however, go on the Radical Agenda. And the reason I wouldn't is because I don't want my followers to like hear a bunch of like essentially pro-fascist, anti-freedom bullshit with my name attached to it. I don't want that search engine optimization. I don't want that in the tags. I don't want any of that attachment, relatively speaking, right? So personally speaking, I would not go on their podcast, and I would not have them on mine, because I think they've done all they can to build an exclusionary platform, and I think ultimately they're not there for a voluntary transaction. They're not there for a trade up. But I'm also willing to discuss that strategy with somebody like Dave, you know. So if he wanted to do that, I'd be down. People generally avoid me though because I'm willing to ask really hard questions and like make people uncomfortable. So, but with all that in mind, because I see you have to go relatively soon, I'm gonna ask you one question that I think is very interesting that came up on my Facebook. Um, Hody Johns wanted me to ask you how to generate positive attention for a movement that's very easy to ignore politically, especially one where the RNC and DNC will stomp out the voices of freedom in their own parties so effectively. How is the LP to succeed?
Oh, I don't think that's. I think the logic of that question is that there is a single silver bullet, and I don't think um, if I pretended to be able to tell you that there was and that I've got all the answers, then you should probably be skeptical of me um, as well. But I will say that for me, um, I'm doing all of my work over the years, has been towards identifying what I think would be helpful to grow and expand the movement. And as the years have passed, um, you know, I've grown and matured as a person, and all of my most recent work has been around body immunity, and that's really that culmination of like many observations over the years about um, who's fighting with who and why they're fighting with who they're fighting with, and that it would be beneficial for them to stop fighting and actually address the state. And there's a very practical reason for dismantling. I mean, even things like when the Povertarians were really attacking respectability politics, and then when the Audacious Caucus picked that up and said that no, non-conforming identities matter and bold speech matters, and speaking a sort of an uncompromised truth to power, that matters, even when it makes the listener uncomfortable. All of that matters. And sometimes that was perceived as even being combative. But my point is, like, there was a really like sort of practical like backstory to that, which is that authoritarian logic is built on sort of defining a very narrow range of what counts as respectable, and then presenting career politicians who fit that mold, and then defining everybody out of that by calling them not viable. And that kind of logic, it works against if you don't have wealth or power under that system, then you're blocked out. And if you're blocked out, that means we are blocked out, because the Libertarian Party does not have wealth or power. And I hate to tell all of our entrepreneurial identity politics for cis white men, you may think that you're upper middle class, but you're poor to them. And we are all in the same boat as far as being povertarians to that. So
like fucking like Immortal Technique said, your working class money ain't fucking with me.
exactly. And I think we need to embrace that, and we need to stand like with each other against all that. And that means a whole range of so-called problematic identities, everybody from Vermin Supreme to, well, you, right?
Yeah.
You're considered controversial, right? But I don't even know what's so controversial. I don't hear anything. Everything you say to me sounds perfectly rational. And I want to live in a world where this is no longer considered controversial to say that, coercive systems are causing people's lives to end early every day. Like, that's not a radical idea. I'm not sure if I answered your question, but the point is, with bottom unity, back to that, you asked how we do that is we need a mass movement. We need to be surrounded by majority anti-authoritarian thinkers, so that when and if either the state collapses, or a small group of people decide that it's time for the boogaloo, or maybe we're even civilized enough to actually just dismantle it, structural, like in a structured manner. Any of those things could happen, but the outcome is I want to live in a world where people actually are vigilant, that they aren't susceptible to these the ways I've talked about through this podcast about authoritarian logic, and that we see through those things, that we are no longer indoctrinated by authoritarian schools, not to be able to see through them. Do you see what I'm saying?
Well, you,
So how
you
do we?
seem to want people to grow better roots and watch their roots to make sure that they grow better trees.
Yes, and I think we will get attention when we like,
By
you
your
know,
works you shall be known.
yes, yes. I mean, you know, it's going to happen. It's happening more and more all the time, and I'm so excited to see that Hodie's listening. Hi, Hodie.
Well, so I guess my last question is, um, what would your number one thing you would say to shock people to alertness be? Because we can't, these roots are deeply fucking buried. Deeply fucking buried. And in order to get them visible, we have to be able to see them. So, how do you get people to see themselves and reality for what it is?
Well, I have this fantasy of going on the Ellen show and just talking about my personal history of surviving addiction and homelessness, because there are so many like personal stories that I have. I'll just one story. I woke up in a public park one morning where I had gone to sleep the night before, and everything I owned was in this bag that was by my head. But somehow during the night, someone walked by and took my bag. Right. So everything I own is now gone. Well, I wake up in the morning with a cop in my face, and he's there to protect property. But guess what? It wasn't my property, because the first thing I said is, "Where's my bag?" And he said, "That's not my problem." So, and I proceeded to get cited for a camping violation, and the state, you know, stole more of my property by fining me. Um, so my point is, I feel like what gets people's attention is stories like that, like actual practical examples of how the state purports to protect people, but actually ruins their lives. And
Humanizing shit.
humanizing it, you know? And I mean, Ellen's audience eats shit like that up. They just do. So, um,
So,
and
humanizing it and then finding platforms you think that would spread on.
yes. And the cool thing about, like, at least when I tell those stories, is that it isn't political spin. It's not even theory. It's just a real world example of how the system tells you one thing, but does something completely else. And then if we're connecting that to anti-authoritarian solutions, like, why does anyone need to claim ownership over, like, whose ground was that to sleep on in the first place? Why do I need permission to like lay down and go to sleep? You know what I
Mm-hmm.
mean?
Right. Well, okay. So, I guess then my actual last question would be, where can people find you, and where can people find the best resources you're involved in?
My public figure page on Facebook is the number one way I keep in touch with people. So it's facebook.com/Mikester for Liberty with the number 4, or you can just search for Mike Shipley on Facebook. You'll find me. My icon is the yellow star, the yellow black star on a gold background. Um, just search for these names on Facebook. These are the collection of caucuses and groups that I'm affiliated with. There's Outright Libertarians, which is the Gender and Sexual Minority Caucus. There's the Povertarian Caucus, which stands up for low income people and tries to help us get to conventions so that we are politically represented in party decisions. There's the Libertarian Party Audacious Caucus, which is about sort of challenging respectability norms and standing up for nonconforming presentation and identities. There is the Libertarian Socialist Caucus, which is calling for basically the standing up for the bottom left and making sure that we're represented in the party and that we have a place and a home. Of course, I am on Twitter and Instagram, so just look for Mike Shipley on there. And Bottom Unity doesn't have really a page per se. It's more of like you could look for hashtag bottom unity, and you could see content by all kinds of different people that have been inspired by that idea. So if you follow those things, you'll get plugged in, and just start following more pages and making friends from there, and you'll be in.
Yeah, and I mean, my particular approach to bottom unity that I sort of started before I knew about bottom unity is anarcho-coalitionism, and that actually does have a page. I'm going to start populating that with coalitionism noise, trying to build coalitions between different sorts of libertarians. And by libertarian, I don't mean fucking party people. I mean like libertarian on the libertarian/authoritarian axis, more like what you're talking about. Um,
Cool. Oh, wait, before I forget, I wanted to mention the Voluntaryist Caucus just one more time.
yeah,
Um, I didn't go deep into detail, but I think it's important. So voluntarism, I don't think it really, let's see, voluntarism is really not strongly typed as a left or a right,
right,
really. It's kind of just like live and let live. I think in predominantly capital L or ANCAP spaces, um, it has probably more right affiliated thinkers than left, but there's nothing inherently about it that makes it like it needs to be. So my point being, like in terms of an ideological label, it's really well suited for making it possible for right and left libertarians to organize together specifically as a caucus. And that's why I'm really excited about the project, because once upon a time, before bottom unity existed, um, basically all of the radicalism in the party, all of the anarchism was basically ANCAPism. And then when the Libertarian Socialist Caucus came out, like it was labeled on its own, right? So
right.
my point is, we have all this like anarchist diversity across the bottom, but they're also all like labeled different things. And so now that there's a new like voluntarist caucus, I think there's a place to find kind of like a peaceful middle ground, um, that can bring and even like the Mises caucus um, has a high number of anarcho-capitalists in it. But because of the like sort of economic culture war that we went through 2 years ago, like there's just like a deeply fractured division even there. And I'm really excited about the idea of a voluntarist caucus that can kind of like reframe all of that
Cut through the noise.
give radicals a space to be together and not have to be wearing labels that were maybe helpful 2 years ago but aren't helpful anymore.
Right. Well, okay. And so one thing I want to say before I end this stream, I think, and I don't know why he follows me on Twitter, but maybe this is something Yang and I could talk about at some point. Um, the UBI thing, I think, has potential in the libertarian circles, but not from a government perspective. He's trying to do something similar with Monobase, but I think that that's dead in the water because people don't fucking like. I've been waiting for my confirmation forever. So maybe there would be a way to help your Povertarian caucus by starting a blockchain-based UBI system for people on poverty.
That would be cool. I would love to work on that some more. I like the idea of UBI, but I agree with you. I think we have to be really, really skeptical of sort of connecting that to any kind of like a confiscatory taxation scheme. Um, or I've heard George's narratives where it's connected to like a land value tax.
Eh.
Don't freak out because it has the word tax in it. But if there was like a crypto way to like ensure that that wasn't as vulnerable to exploitation as I think like an analog one would be, I think there's some potential for something really awesome there.
Yeah, so I mean, if any of you out there who subscribe to me or follow me anywhere, who aren't afraid of my fucking cynical ass, if any of you are working on blockchain projects or have anything related to that, maybe you two could, you and Mike could get coordinated on that, and the Povertarian Caucus could do something extremely concrete.
Yay! Awesome. Thank you for that.
Yeah. Anyway, so find you on Facebook, find you on Twitter. I'll leave you with the last word. What should people know?
Just remember that the bottom unity era is about inclusivity. Unity, though, is not uniformity. You are not obligated to tolerate authoritarians. So you can do as little or as much accountability work as you want. But beyond that, please just have fun with it. Always assume that the best of another person's intentions, even if they're using language different than yours. And remember that we're stronger when we have that intellectual diversity, because it allows us to meet statist and authoritarian voters and even non-affiliated non-voters where they're at. So find your place and figure out what resonates with you and what you're best at, and just go do it. And together we can reach a world set free.
All right, that sounds great. So, for any of you who are still here, this stream is brought to you by Liberty Professionals. Liberty Professionals will help you secure your home, small business, and life. It's run by a residential security expert who's an ASIS board certified physical security professional. Also, if you need work done in the Virginia area, they do missing persons investigations, skip tracing, and more. Contact them for more info. Finian has all the necessary tools in his toolbox to bring you peace of mind and stability for the future. Support Liberty businesses and these streams by heading over to libertyprofessionals.com to get your consult today. Also, I can be sponsored by any of you as well. Feel free to hit me up for that sort of thing. I work with your budget to provide a relatively good rate for a monthly subscription to my services. And also, if you decide that you just want to support what I do, there are many ways in the description, and I thank you deeply for your support. Also, for liking, sharing, and subscribing. Those are the primary ways that my messages get out there. And if my messages don't get out there, I'm pretty much fucking useless. So, feel free to help me help you all. Anyway, smash the state. It's time we fuck this place up.
Thanks for having me on.
Thank you for coming.